questions in the light of the objectives. This is the topic of the third session this morning, and I will rely also on what you heard from the two previous presentations. Let me start with an introduction to the question that we had here when it comes to the objective. And once again, I'm not reducing objective here to the specific meaning of maqasid that we have in the specific Islamic literature when it comes to maqasid al-sharia, or perceived within a specific field. And this is why the second presentation by Sheikh Chauki is helping me in a way which is talking about the overall understanding of the objective. And the objectives, which are what are the goals of our life. And as it was said, when he referred to verses that we have in the Quran, which once again we can have different understanding of them. So this very specific goal, which is worshipping God, and this is why we have the Creator. At the same time, what was said by one of you, Salma, when she was talking about the limits of what we can understand, I think also that this is part of our understanding of Islam, is that there are things that are within the realm of rationality, and things that are rational in the way they are based on the limits of rationality. Right? The way to say that there are limits to rationality is not irrational. It's very rational to say there are limits to rationality. And this is something also that we have within our legal, I would say, theological, with quote unquote, because I have a problem with us reducing, for example, ilm al-kalam to theology. I think that ilm al-kalam is not only theology and philosophy altogether, and within the field of everything which has to do with our creed, al-aqidah, but also something which has to do with the Muslim philosophers as well as the fuqaha. So when we say worshipping God, what we understand, and I'm not going to repeat, so the overall understanding of our faith is to acknowledge His presence. Our actions should rely on His direction, and our thought should be reassessed, and we have to think about the way we think in the light of what He's expecting us to do. And this dimension of thoughts, I will come to it later when it comes to assessing the means. So we have been talking about the overall understanding of Vicegerency and overall. And by the way, I don't agree that it's not in the Islamic tradition. The problem is that in the legal tradition it's not everywhere. But if you come to the philosophical tradition, of course you have it. Of course, when you deal with Al-Farabi, for example, dealing with the Greek philosophers, he's dealing with something which is essential of the understanding of the very meaning of human being. He's taking it from both not being, not betraying the Islamic tradition, but dealing with the Greek tradition. And we also have this in our understanding of the overall understanding of concept of human being. And this is also dealing with in the Sufi tradition. In the Sufi tradition, there is something here which is quite interesting in all our understanding. So I would say here that when it comes to this, what I agree with is there is no manhaj, there is no something which is a systematic way of looking at it. Or if there is, and this is where Dr. Mohamed, I think, is right in raising the point, is very much in a very modern way to deal with power and politics, which is problematic. Because the concept is beyond this, and even the understanding of Al-Khulafa al-Rashidun. But if we come to what was said, الأمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر في الأمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر, we have something which is also our understanding الذين إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة. This is something also which is the understanding of what it means to be a believer. When you are settled on earth, you have first the vertical dimension, أقاموا الصلاة, which is acknowledging and respecting God prescription, and not only acknowledging that He is, but responding to His call. Praying is not acknowledging there is one God, is responding to the call. Is responding to the call. وَآتَوُ الزَّكَاةَ is responding to the call, but also understanding the horizontal responsibility that you have towards human beings. Zakat is something that you do as it is for God, but you understand that there is a human dimension, because the zakat is the purifying social tax that you are paying. وَأَمَرُ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَنَهَى عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ, which is part of this understanding, which is opening up the vertical, the horizontal, and your role on earth. It's to command what is right and to resist what is bad. So this is something which is our understanding wherever you are. In مَكَّنَّاهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ, wherever you are, God, the transcendence, human beings, responsibility, spreading what is right and resisting, spreading what is wrong, right and resisting what is wrong. So this dimension here is also connected to what was said in the discussion before. So the starting point of this, it's important because this is where, as Muslims, as believers, as human beings even, we have to start the discussion. It's understanding the goals, the aims, why. And then inductively you come to the means that we have. The problem in the Islamic traditions very often with specialized field is that we end up questioning the means and forgetting the goals. And then we are lost in this. While we are at the same time very faithful of the goals of the means, but not the overall goal in which and for which we have to use the means. If you understand what I mean. So for this, achieving this, we need to ask ourselves what was given to us by God, if we are believers. So it was said, and we repeated this, is that He gave us the revelation, and the revelation is to remind us of the very essence of our life. So the texts, and the text from an Islamic perspective is the Quran. And by the way, not only the final text is also to take into consideration that everything that you can find in other texts that was not prohibited and not removed from our text is also valid for us. So it's a very, very broad understanding of the cycle of prophecies that we have as Muslims. And if we gave us text, we have to rely on them, and He gave us the Prophet, peace be upon him, as a model. And once again, here there is something which is to be dealt with. And I will come to this because, once again, my whole talk is what He gave us as means, and then in which way we have to deal with the means in the light of the goals. That's the main discussion that I am having with you today. So, but He also gave us, and this is straight from the beginning of the revelation, He gave us the world as a book as well. So it's a very new way of dealing with it when we speak about the book, the creation as a book. But in fact, at the same time, it's something which is quite old in our tradition, which is when it comes to reading the Quran, understanding the Quran is telling us, look at the world, and the world you will have Sunan Kawniyya, you have Thaqafat, you have the way the people were dealing with it, and even some of the way we are dealing in Arabic with some of the rules, or things that are becoming rules, or understood rules, are very much a way you deal with the reality. يسألونك ماذا أحل لهم قل أحل لكم الطيبات. الطيبات is everything which is good, but the very essence of what is good is also a mindset which is very important in the way we deal with the creation. The creation is first open to our understanding, and the scholars came with this, which is the original permission. And tayyibat is everything, except where there are limits. So it's a very positive way to look at the world. It's a very positive way to look at the creation as a gift and as a book. And the book is that you have to deal with Sunan al-Kawniyya. There are rules that you cannot avoid. These rules are qat'iyyat, are as much to be respected as you have qat'iyyat in the Quran. You can't work against the rules of the creation. You have to deal with it. And for this you have to study the world. You have to study. You have to get the knowledge of the world if you want to be faithful. And in fact, there is no way to be faithful to the goals if you don't get the rules of what was given to you, the texts and the creation. So this is part of the whole understanding that we have to get here. But once again, there are multiple levels in the way you deal with the creation and multiple levels in the way you deal with the book. So you need to reassess every time the way you deal with the two sources as means to be able to achieve your goals. And whatever is the situation, through history, new challenges are coming from both, from the texts and from the creation. New questions are coming. As much as you are getting knowledge, new questions are coming and you have to reassess. Which means that in fact, it's embodied in Islam that you have to go through tajdeed, to renewal, to reform your mind, your way of understanding things. So there is no way of being intellectually passive if you want to be spiritually faithful. No way. So you have to come with the two altogether. And my way of now being critical of our tradition, but constructively critical. I'm not following a path where everything is wrong with us. No, we destroying for the sake of destroying and think that you are very intelligent because you are able to destroy. It's silly. So it's the constructive way of dealing with things. And what I want to do is to come to the mean through some of the objectives that we need to clarify when it comes to this discussion. So it's an inductive thinking that I'm trying to get through two or three things that were important in my own education. Is that in fact the deductive thinking that you may find even with fuqaha, even with philosophers, by the way, or even with the mystical tradition, the deductive thinking, in fact, you might go with it without getting a sense that at one point you are following something but you might not agree on the goal. So you go along, but you are not sure that you are achieving the same. You don't have that. So the point is, intellectually, it was for me, and this is what I'm sharing with you, sometimes much more constructive for me to say, okay, let us start with the other question, which is, where do you want to go? Tell me what is the goal. So this is the why question. Why? Which is very essential. Very often we are saying sciences are asking how. Philosophies and religions are responding to why. Yes? Say the why. Why are we here? And what we see with religious sciences, we end up being obsessed with the how and forgetting the why. As if it's acknowledged, we agreed upon. And I think that this is a problem. And we see discussions among scholars, fuqaha or falasifa or mutasawwifin, they are discussing within something that was supposed to address the why. Endless discussion about how it is going to work, how, and it's a power struggle on how and not the deep question on why. So this is why I think that, and this is why I acknowledge and respect all the discussion that we have in every field. My question is not to dismiss or to underestimate this, is to put it in the right places, at the right level. So if we come to the why question, and if we come to what was, in fact, the first Islamic so-called, but we can take it as it is, because it's a science, it's a real science, which has to do with al-fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, is how do we deal with the rules in a specific, and once again, we can have all the discussion about and I think that I will come to the discussion that we had this morning, because I think it's a critical discussion. We need to open that. The question is how and why we open it. How and why are we opening it? Because you are dealing with, we have to be very careful where you put your questions. Because if you think that all your questions are ideologically void, you are in danger. It depends how you address the issue. But this is another question, we'll come back to it. So the basic intuition that we had in the fiqh that we had is very quickly we had scholars when they were dealing with a hukm in the Quran, they were asking al-illa, which is the raison d'être, and the raison d'être al-illa is why? Why this rule? So the question that there is a rule and that you are asking at your level, and by the way, all the philosophy that came from the maqasid afterward, it was not that nothing was there before. The systematization of something that was already there was fiqh is something that came later and said, oh, the overall message came from why? What are the main higher objectives? الضروريات المقاصد الضرورية. So this is something that came also in the discussion, but the first stage, straight away, some of the fuqaha, some of the scholars very quickly, and even when Mu'az ibn Jabal was asked by the Prophet is on what you are going to rely, and all the discussion that we know about this, there is something which is an intuition that when you have a rule, you question the why. Why you are going to have this. And once again, this is something that we have in so I don't agree with the people saying, oh, it's a modern way of dealing with it, or it came with a Shatibi and before him was El-Ghazali or El-Jureidini about the maqasid. In fact, it's very early that we had this question, why are we having to, the why of the rules is something that we have in our legal tradition. It's something which is very important. It's very important, but it's very important to come to the second stage, which was what I was referring to and to what I asked you to read. I was mentioning this tradition where we have scholars at one point saying we need to take a step back and to think about the overall picture and ask ourselves the why of the message itself. So Jureidini did this, he's a student in Al-Ghazali, and we were talking also about Ishrat. The point here which is very interesting is that when we go from the details asking why, the why of a rule or a specific rule, and then you come and you ask yourself the why of the message itself and what are the priorities and how are we going to classify this. And you take something which is important where, for example, after all these centuries, scholars say we have to be very careful. It might be that the way we are dealing between the Meccan period and the Medinian period has to be reassessed, because we have to look at the rules of the Medinian period in the light of kulliyat of the Meccan period, which is the higher principles that were, the vision that was here. In fact, he was just saying, you know what, in the Meccan period there was a philosophy of life. In the Medinian period it was its translation into rules. So if you come to the rules without having the philosophy that came first, we are lost. Because we end up taking the means as the goals, not understanding that the means are the means for the goal that came before, the big picture. That's essential. That's essential why? Because in our history it happened. And not only it happened in our history, in fact, any one of you who is studying philosophy, psychology, experimental sciences, you know that at one point the sciences could at the end be the means substituted to the goals, and it's a way of deconstructing the whole thing, which is in itself an ideology. An ideology that is with science, which is removing the goals and all the discussion that we have as to the meanings of knowledge and the meanings of sciences. So it happened to us. Nothing special in the Islamic tradition. It happened to us, and we had scholars and we had traditions questioning this and asking us, or being critical with the Islamic legacy by saying, now we have to reassess this. It happened in the mystical tradition. What was said about Ihya Ulumuddin was this intuition. It happened in many, in fact, in every single field that we have, in fiqh, in usul al-fiqh, in aqidah, you have scholars that were always coming and say, be careful. Now we are missing the goals if we stay on these discussions. So we had this in our history in every field, which is also important. There is something which is important also, that when you keep in mind the objectives. There are three things that you cannot avoid in the way things are moving within a science or between the sciences. And the first question is always this one, which is important, is the structure of knowledge, is the way things are structured. Which once again was clearly here. If, for example, for example, the ulama, Jureidini were coming and say, okay, we have the structure is they have priority. There are things that are priority, that they are coming first. So they are giving a structure. So the goals are always questioning the structure of your means. So you have to deal with this and not to take it for granted. What we have to do with ulama in all our field, very often we come with Islamic sciences and we take it for granted. I'm sorry. The history of Islamic sciences is a history which was produced by human beings. So we have to deal with the structure. Where does this structure come from? The second is this categorization. Structure is where you could think, and also the categorization. So we have a categorization of knowledge in Islam. Of course, we have a categorization of knowledge. So this is the second question that you have to ask. First, the structure. The second, the categorization. And third, the hierarchy. The hierarchy is not exactly the same as categorization. You will not have a hierarchy without categorization. You can have a categorization seemingly telling you there is no hierarchy. But in fact, today, in our fields as Muslims, the authority in Islam is mainly coming from the fuqaha, the legal field. So there is a hierarchy. There is a hierarchy that we are implicitly acknowledging, and there is a struggle between people who are saying, okay, we have to be careful within the hierarchy, within the so why is it that at the end we have this as being the main sciences? And this is where in history you can understand this. As much as you see the West putting as the first field to resist the Muslim presence is the legal one, you will have exactly the same in our history. The legal field is the first, a civilization, a religion feel that they can protect themselves from being distorted from within. But is it right? Is it right? If you are a Western Muslim, you understand that it's not by law that they are going to prevent you from being a Muslim. So it's a lost battle. In our history, from our perspective as Muslims, we have exactly the same. If we think that we are going to protect Islam and to promote Islam, the very essence of this message, which with its goals through the legal framework is a lost battle. As much as you can be protected by law, you can be imprisoned by law, by the same law that are protecting you. So we have to reassess the objectives here and say, what are we doing in this? And this is where, so once again, be clear on this. So it's me inside. I'm sorry, it's so cold. And that's it. I still have 25 minutes to go. And it was my introduction. So, so what I was saying is that when we question who the goals, you question the structure, the categorization, and the hierarchy. And you can see that, as I said, as a science, the first science that we have is the legal. But also as our involvement in the world, and this is where I agree with the way it happened also in our way of dealing with even the Prophet ﷺ, or even our sources, is this focus on power and political power. Because it's also something which is a perception that this is from where we are going to be protected. It's through the political power. Why today we know that you can get what political power you want if you don't have other powers at play are going to be lost. Be the head of the state doesn't mean anything if you don't have a take on culture, on economy, on media. That's over. Globalized world is telling you the state is not the question. The state is but a means. And if you think it's a goal, you are misled. So once again, these are all questions that we have to ask in our way of dealing with questioning the means in the light of the goals, and as I said, the goal at the beginning. Now, if we come to a notion that is connected to this discussion here, and we ask ourselves, okay, if we come to the big picture that was said by Sheikh Chauki this morning, and we might disagree on things. For example, I was more in tune, you refer to Farouqi, but I think that it's coming from all our tradition that Tawhid is everywhere. It's the starting point, should get the top of everything. And then the way you deal with it inside, the intimate, I would say Tawhid is at the top of everything and everywhere. In fact, it's the top, it's the bottom, it's the whole. I would go that way. Even though I agree that it's part also of Tazkiyah, which is the way we experience Tawhid in ourselves. So it's here, but it's not only here. But this was said by, and this is where sometimes, you know, the Salafi on this, they are good. Tawhid is Tawhid, and I think that this is why I like them. And the Sufi, by the way, this is the only thing on which the Sufi and the Salafi agree. Tawhid within, Tawhid outside, Tawhid everywhere.
All Muslims. All Muslims agree on that.
I agree. So we were discussing the concept of Khilafah, which is in fact, or at least, pushing us to put the question about the goal, about the overall objective here. That once again, I am not going to refer again to this, but I would say that as much as there is this dimension of worshipping and our specific way of worshipping and coming back to our fitra and all this, there are two things that are within the goal, means that are within al-Khilafah that we have to protect as essential. Sheikh Chauki referred to reason as there is no revelation without reason, and on this we agree, that's the point. But I would say something which is now coming in the political field through all the last experiences, that is in fact everywhere and should be everywhere in our understanding. So there will be no way of dealing with al-Aqidah, and dealing with the rules, and dealing with al-Khilafah as a goal if with reason there is no freedom. Which is once again something which is not new in the Islamic literature, is that reason here has to do with the very specific understanding of freedom. And we have to put freedom at the beginning, not to be caught at the end by not having discussed the notion of freedom, and we have to deal with it in a Western way of putting the question. If you miss it at the beginning, you will be caught with the right question at the end. Is that what do you deal? How do you deal with freedom? And it means freedom in everything. It's from freedom of worship, freedom of conscience, that sometimes in our majority tradition we were not clear about this. Muslims were not clear about it. In fact, they were clear, but not always in the right way. At least the majority trend about this, which is essential. And I would say in Khilafah, if there is Khilafah in the way Sheikh Chauki was putting it, is reason is essential and freedom is unavoidable as the first principle, as the goal that you have to protect, in fact, because this is where there is a difference. وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ. It's out of worshipping. By definition, we are the one who are worshipping. And human beings is by choice, knowledge and choice. And on this, I think that we have to come with a very deep discussion about the way we deal with this. And this is where these are the two main principles that I would say are also part of al-Khilafah in the overall understanding that we had before. And two things also that we need to deal with is al-Amr bil-Ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar has to do with an ethical reference. And we need to have an ethics to protect and a way to set. And the way is, ثم جعلناك على شريعة من الأمر فاتبعها. This path, this way, is based on rules. There are things that halal halal or haram haram. So you cannot avoid this as well. So there is knowledge, there is freedom, there are rules, and there are ethical values that you have to set and to protect and to respect. So this is part of all our understanding from our understanding. So I would say here that if you come with this and you set the rules with this understanding, you can't go ahead the way we are going without having first something which is what is from our objective, the concept of human being that we are promoting. Because the question that you ask, Salma, is not by accident, but there is something, if there is no original sin, and we don't have absolute knowledge, and we know that in this life there will be new utopia. It's not going to be perfect, and you know this. So that at the end there is a big question, what is your concept of human being? What is your concept of human being? And this is where you enter into a discussion with yourself and with the other on equal footing. First with your own self, what is the concept of human being? In fact, the human being that has to achieve these goals in the light of al-Khilafah. Look at our literature, very often is not there. Even, and this is why Al-Ghazali, when he rejected philosophy, was having this impression that the Greek philosophy was taking over, and this was for with Ibn Sina. That's true. That's true. And the one who was rejecting and saying we have to come with an internal methodology of Ibn Taymiyyah, and this is why the West doesn't like it. By the way, the Orientalists, they didn't like and don't like Ibn Taymiyyah, not only because he is harsh and tough, but he has a take in towards the Western philosophy, which is quite interesting. In fact, you will think, without him reading them, Garodi, who was a French philosopher, when he said that's over with the Greek philosophy and the being and everything because this is misleading, in fact, he came to some of the conclusions that were there in the 14th century in Ibn Taymiyyah. That's also something that we need to get here, is the concept of human being is something that we have to nurture from within. So we have to reconcile ourselves with, okay, we have these objectives. What does it mean as us being human beings, responding to the call of God? That's a question which has to do with all the means that we'll have, because it has to do also with two other things. Sheikh was referring to a philosophy of what? What was the he said philosophy, we forgot. That's good. So who knows what he said? You said philosophy or something? Anyway, he put philosophy somewhere. And but I think that with the concept of human being and the goals, when you know the goals, and if you go to all the philosophical systems before, what they had is to do two things. Is to set a system, a structure that is helping you to get to a goal, a specific goal. This is what we call a philosophy. In our way of dealing with al-Khilafah, our way of understanding, you know what? We are here, and there is transcendence, there is human responsibility, and we have to promote what is right and resist what is good, knowing that is not going to be perfect. That we have to deal with suffering, we have to deal with bloodshed, we have to deal with wars, and this is done, and this is there. God knew it, the angels knew it, you don't know why, but you know that you have to resist. That's it. You know that you have to resist and to promote what is good. This is your ethical presence. By definition, your presence is an ethical presence. The goal is this, is to avoid as much as possible the bad and to promote what is good and justice and all the things. So there is a concept of human being, and then there is something which has to do with the way you deal with all your knowledge. Everything you know should serve this purpose. So you need a philosophy of knowledge. a philosophy of science that is based on this. Why? Because if you don't get this, you are going to be lost in all the sciences. And the contemporary sciences, many of them have one goal, is for you to forget the goal. In philosophical terms, the deconstructivist approach is exactly this. At one point, everything is relative because you are not using the means for a specific goal. So when I'm discussing with somebody who is saying, there is no God, Edgar Morin, who wrote about the complexity, is saying that's the question. Is that in fact there is an ideology of the end of ideology which is deconstructing everything, and it's not by accident. It's not by accident. So you have to come equipped with your own. But the problem is that if you look at us now, we are trying to deal with fatawa, ahkam, and we come with, and we in fact are lost in the things, and we ourselves are taking some of the means at the ultimate goal of our answer. This is my answer. No, it's not an answer. It's just a protection. It's just a way you deal with the issue. So, in order to protect yourself. So, a philosophy of knowledge, which is producing what, in fact, we know now in the contemporary discussion about an epistemology. But you have an epistemology before epistemology. By the way, you know what? You have ecology before ecology in the Islamic understanding of principles. And you have an epistemology before epistemology by saying, ask yourself, from transcendence to human responsibility, what you have to do on earth. And then all your knowledges should serve this purpose in one way or in another. And this is why you have to question the hierarchy. Because if you have a hierarchy where the legal comes first, or state comes first, it means that you yourself, you are putting a categorization that is coming from where? In the name of what? Who told you this? Why is it today that we are obsessed with political power? How is it, for example, that we are so weak in producing an alternative economic system while trying to get the best, or I would say the worst, of the capitalist system by taking the profit and try to avoiding some of the rules? At the end, we are not questioning the goals. Do you want to make money, or do you want economy to serve humanity? Do you want to make halal money? What is the point? Because you can see the distortion of our approaches through the way that we are not questioning the goals of the sciences itself, if they are sciences, because I would say that economy is not a science. It's full of ideological input. It's a human science. It's not an experimental science part of any ideology. So I would say here that dealing with this, let me just be clear with my time. 20 minutes left. Good. So I would say here that we need this, which is the concept of human being, which is helping us to come with the way we deal with the means, the philosophy of knowledge that we need. And there is something that we also need, which is part of the whole discussion, which is the philosophy of law. And I would say that anything that came with Al-Maqasidiyun and everything that they added, in fact, at one point in history, feel that we have laws, but there is a need of a philosophy of law. But the problem is that the main objectives that we had, what we call Al-Maqasid now, are also coming from the realm of the legal, and not from a philosophy of law, understanding that we have to integrate the concept of human being and the philosophy of knowledge. All these should be part of the maqasid. If it's only the legal producing a philosophy of law, you still remain in the same field. You don't have the overall. So it's a fragmented overall understanding. It's based on the philosophy of law without having a concept of man, and how without integrating this in a philosophy of knowledge. That how do we deal with this? How do we serve this? And you may end up distorting the very meaning of the maqasid by being partial or fragmented in the way you deal with it. I don't know if you get me here, but this is once again something which is important. And this is why I would say that if you come with these goals, in fact, you understand that you have to work on many fields with the same approach. In fact, you have to deal with the self. So this is why what we had within your presentation about the self, this understanding of the concept of human being is dealing with the self. There is no future with us if we don't integrate into our knowledge everything which is coming from the mystical tradition. It's not mystical versus legal. It's mystical because it's legal. The mystical is part of it. So any discourse that is coming with the Salafi saying that the rules and everything, not breaking into the discussion the mystical dimension, that in fact the concept of human being, al-khilaf, starts with your own self. So the Khalifa, as we were talking about it, and even, by the way, even if it's not in the tradition, we have to, there are things that were not neglected by the tradition that we have to highlight now, because they understand the very essence of it. When the globalized world is fragmented, what is your center? What is your goal? What is your access? What is your access when people are telling you, you know what, everything is relative. Everything. I say, okay, that's fine. Let me think about a hukm about this. Or about, no, the access, it's important. So the self, it's important, and this is where I would say it's important. So it's not, and this is where the discussion can be with Dr. Mu'taz, because I will come to this, but in this discussion, it's not because it's not in the tradition, and even, for example, if politics or power was not there in the tradition, it's quite modern, still, from an objective viewpoint, questioning the why, we have to integrate this into our discussion. Is how do we deal with power? How do we deal with politics? In a way or in another, we have to respond to this. And from where the questions or the answers are going to come is something which is essential. So I would say the self is important, society is important. There is a lack in our Islamic tradition, something which has to do with the civil society, about the followers, not the leaders, about the community as a community, the society, the social dimension here. And it's yes, Sharia, and we'll talk about this when it comes to politics, I think, in 3 days. But I think that society here, as what do we want to achieve when it comes to promoting what is right and resisting what is bad. And as I said, politics, economics, and the poor parent that we have in the whole discussion is culture. We are not aware, and not enough aware, that one of the most powerful means today is coming from culture. And this is when you come back to the Quran and say, why is it that the halal, or what was perceived as halal, the translation and the word that we have in the Quran is al-ma'ruf, known by the people as being good. Ma'ruf, it's known. So ma'ruf means, in fact, in the legal translation, is what is halal, it's accepted. But there is something which is based on the collective intuition, natural take, and accepted rule. All together in one word. I say, why? How is it? But in fact, there is power in culture. So we had this with Bourdieu now, with Foucault, and all these sociologists who came with the capital culture, or the cultural capital. So this is something which is essential here. And you can see everywhere that it's happening even between us as Muslims. The cultural capital, when you speak Arabic, and the Arab cultures versus the others. That's something which is there. Of course it's there. There is a power struggle from within as to the cultures that are leading. And you have now in the States, some of our scholars say, you know what? The renewal is coming from outside the Arabs. Because they have a problem. So there is a discussion here. And some are not saying outside the Arabs, are even saying by the converts. Because they are coming with fresh eyes. Which is true and wrong at the same time, as you know. Because some are entering by making sure that they, with their new eyes, they look at it with the Arab eyes. So they are Arabized in the way they look at it. So now, having said this, I come to the second part of my conclusion at the same time here, which is, I still have 15 minutes to close it. Yeah. So the assessment of our means. So having said this, this is the overall objective and what we have to do to come to this discussion. And I would say here that when it comes to the concept of human being, and human being as a human, we are at the same time, and you know what it's essential for us, it's to start with ourselves and to come to what we have to achieve. Four things are important for us that are means that at the same time things that we have to protect. The first one is what was said, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Human dignity is essential. And human dignity is part of what we want to protect. And it's at the same time a fact and something which is part of our way of dealing with ourselves, with humanity. And this is why I don't have a problem with anybody who is coming to me and say, you know what, from an Islamic perspective, we can deal with women's rights. It depends how you tackle the issue. How you tackle the issue. As human rights coming as, you know, a system or a reference or a chart or a declaration that is taking human rights seriously. I don't have a problem with this. I don't have a problem with this if, once again, I'm able to put it in the way I'm dealing with the goals that I want to achieve, which is no human rights without stressing on the human responsibility and the human responsibility. And this is where we are today. So this is the added value of an Islamic discourse in anything which has to do with rights, the human conception of responsibility towards ourselves, towards nature, and towards our fellow human beings. So integrating the declaration within a concept of human being. It's much more important than rejecting the means by saying we don't have anything to do. Well, you know what, we have 2 articles, there is a problem there. This is what we had from scholars, say, oh, we have 2 articles, we don't agree with them. Not getting the whole thing, which is the whole ideological take on it, which is much more important here. And as I said, knowledge, it's important, freedom, maybe it's important, and what was said also in so to bear the trust that we have, something that you have. And once again, whatever is your take on I didn't have the choice, no, you didn't have the choice. You didn't have the choice to be a human being. But this is our fate. This is what we have to do. We are bearing the trust and we have to deal with it. And the deal with it is acknowledging God and spread what is good on earth as much as we can. And in doing so, we are witnesses before human beings. This is it. We are witnesses by trying our best to respond to the call of God. And as I said, the concept of human being, which has to do once again with something which is essential. Why do we have to come with this? Because we had seminars in our discussion on ethics, for example, in bioethics, in psychology. And we can get it, that if you keep on talking about contemporary sciences without having a concept of human being, which is much more than only mind and body, there is a very important, you know, even about health, if you don't put heart as an essential dimension, and culture and well-being, and all this together, your definition of human being, that is what is a well-being when it comes to human being, you are going to be lost by the sciences that are deconstructing the whole thing. So I would say here that in our assessment of the means, we have to start with this elements that is so important, reason, heart, and body, and how it works and why we have to deal with it. Now, having said this, I come back to the beginning of my talk and say, what are the means that we have? And we said we have the texts, and we take them seriously. Now, having said this, in the light of the goals, we need to come back to the scriptural sources and to assess what was done in our tradition. And this is where, in the name of what we are trying to achieve, it's important to say, okay, for example, the authority of the Quran and the authority of the hadith, the prophetic traditions. And this is where, for example, I will integrate into discussion the way we have to deal with the means, the way we have to deal with the scriptures. And this is where we have to be critical, constructively critical, by saying, you know, we came from a history. So there are texts, and then why is it that at some point in history we focused on this, we gave priority on this, and we expanded the scope of authority in that way. How it is. So the point is that you are critical and questioning your sources and your scriptural sources with a framework, and not in a scattered way with nothing, and taking from, for example, and that's the problem that I may have with some of the scholars, not Dr. Mu'attaz, but so many others, that they are coming with the critical means that we have now called hermeneutics. And when you go with hermeneutics, there is something which is an assumption elsewhere that this book is as all the other books. So in fact, it's undermining the very essence of the faith. So if you have, once again, if you don't have the framework that is helping you to be critical and to push towards this criticism by saying, what is our legacy? Why is it that with these goals, we're not able to manage these means, so we are critical of the means and the way we dealt with the means? That has to be done into a framework, a vision, an overall understanding of what is our goal on earth, and our relationship to God, and our relationship to our brothers and sisters in humanity and within the community. By saying this, it means that any discussion about the scriptural sources and the Islamic legacy on fiqh, usul al-fiqh, even aqeedah and all this, that are not dealing with the deep question of authority, power, limits, definitions, is a critical take on the source that is limiting ourselves. If we don't do this, if we don't understand, and in our tradition, of course, there were power struggle. In our tradition, of course, there were guardians of some of the rules of stressing. And if we are not doing this in the light of our understanding, even in things that were acknowledged and accepted, now sometimes we come to some of our principles or some of the rules that we heard were sacred and known, and say, okay, the West is asking us some questions. And for example, about, for example, changing your religion. And you have now some scholars coming back to this, okay, because that's life. Life is always like this. You are going to be challenged from outside. We might have also to challenge ourselves from within, with some of the questions that were taken from granted, or at least the way we deal with the sources. Once again, not with playing with the book, not with playing with the hadith. It's not a question of pleasing the West or changing. It means that we come to it in the light of the objective that we know that we have to achieve. It's the same, I would say, on the other side, and this is why we are so weak. As much as we have to question our means and the scriptural sources and the hadith, we also have to do exactly the same with contemporary sciences. We have to do exactly the same with experimental sciences and human sciences, in the name of our goals as well. Because what we have is we are dealing with two problems. The first one, as I told you, is fragmentation of knowledge. And fragmentation of knowledge is that now what we have in science is you are experts specialized in one field, we have experts that specialize in other field, and there is no connection. This fragmentation of knowledge is, I'm telling you, and this is my take on it, it's in itself the fulfillment of an ideology. But there is no truth, and there are no rules. So at the end, know as much as you know, and go in fragmenting knowledge, so you don't have an access. So what we were talking about at the beginning, that we have to achieve, that all the knowledges are here to serve a purpose, but there is no purpose. So we fragmented the knowledge. So you have psychology, you have all the human sciences, economy, politics, and everything, and then you have medicine, and you have biology, all fragmentation. So it's a field of specialized knowledge with no center, with no purposes. All the purpose is a very narrow one, not a long-run purpose that we have. The first problem that we have in that field is fragmentation of knowledge. But the second problem that you have is within knowledge is deconstruction of knowledge. So fragmentation and deconstruction are the two main legs of what we have today, which is this postmodernist approach that we have. And we are dealing with this in a way which is coming with our scriptural sources and coming with the Quran, and we are trying in the fragmentation of knowledge to come with ethics and this, rules on that, rules on that, rules on that, and not connecting the knowledges. And within the knowledge, we are unable to come with a vision that is helping us say, okay, economy for what? Politics for what? Psychology for what? Biology for what? Medicine for what? And you are dealing with, and we end up with some scholars looking at some of our practitioners, or for example physicians, in a way which is very respectful. They know what they are talking about. We don't understand that they themselves are in fact dealing with the construction of knowledge, that they don't even know at the end to define what is health from, for example, a spiritual perspective, not a physical one. So you end up coming with a very narrow understanding of the means, and you don't put it in the big picture. And in fact, we do exactly this. So I would like to question all our means, and I said the means that it's the way we deal with the scriptural sources, but also the way we deal with all the other sciences, and the added value of the Muslim minds with all the religious minds is to put some goals and axes and center. So fragmentation of knowledge means there is no goal. The construction of knowledge means there is no center. So we need a center and we need a goal. Do we have it? We have it. We have it. If and only if we come with a philosophy of knowledge, a philosophy, a concept of human being, a philosophy of knowledge, and even a philosophy of law. So are we able to do this? It means that we have to acknowledge the fact that we have to question all our means, but not in a scattered way, not without a center and not without a goal. And this is where we have to come back to this. So I would say here that this is the question that I wanted to put, and as I have 3 minutes, I'm reaching my real conclusion. You know, there is something which is, for me, from an intellectual viewpoint, I would say in referring to Islam, there is something which is a shaitani perspective, which is being critical for the sake of being critical intellectually, which has to do with intellectual arrogance. And that's a very important point, because in fact, if you come with the objectives, and you know, and this is why I like the fact that you say we have to avoid thinking that this world is going to be perfect. No, we are not going to make it perfect. This world is what it is. It's sad, very sad, and it will remain sad. So your happiness is within an ocean of sadness. That's it. The reality is this. It's an ocean of sadness. إن هذا القرآن نزل بحزن, even if it's a hadith ضعيف, the very meaning here is or some are considering as ضعيف, but this Quran it was revealed with sadness. There is something which is sad about this life. It's sad. It's sad for your life, you're going to die. It's sad for your family, and it's sad for the world. Now what do you have to do? Your best. This is where you have to. So you have to be critical with this very humble way of dealing with the goals and the means. I don't know if you understand this. This is very spiritual. It is intellectual humility as part of the critical take on our means in the name of our goal. Intellectual humility is part of coming back to the concept of human being. You're not going to be a human being without your heart, and you're not a human being only with your mind. It's both. So I would say here that our contribution is a very ambitious contribution out of humility. I hope you understand what I mean here. Very ambitious contribution out of humility. The second, in this critical take, we have to check our means. And we have also to deal with our means and also to check how do we deal with them, and it's coming from so this minute I'm over. Good. So, because really, as much as we were facing political colonialism, now we are facing an intellectual colonialism in the West. I see too many Western Muslims very quick to think that because we are accepting the critical thinking of the Western critical thinking, it means that I think that this is why it's very dangerous. This is why it's very dangerous if you don't have the center. So I don't have a problem. I'm a son of the West, but with one thing, that I will never leave the West take from me, which is the center, the axis, the center, which is أقيموا الصلاة الذين إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة, which is essential. It's essential. It's without this, I think we are lost. So we can be critical and we are lost in the whole thing. And as I said, this is why we have to do our best to decolonize our mind as to the means that are taking over, and to recolonize our mind with the objective that should be essential. And then we come through the inductive discussion. Thank you. I'm very happy with myself, not because of the content, but because of my timing. Your question can start, yes. The microphone, can you ask if Ustad? They were laughing the whole talk. I don't know why, but it's worrying.
I thought it was good.
No.
Okay, so my name is Zainab, I'm from Morocco. And I just wanted to comment on one thing you said when you talked about freedom. You said we needed freedom in the way that we reason, in the way that we ponder, and so on. I think it's...
No, it's working. If you...
But you talked as... Anyway, you talked about freedom as being a goal. But I would see freedom more like a means. Because if we reflect upon some recent case studies like freedom of speech, you have to remain coherent with, what's the purpose, for example, of freedom of speech, is to be able to express ourselves against oppression and to make the world a better place. But if you, at the same way, when we start insulting one another and so on, so what I mean by that freedom, for me, it has to be a means of achieving something bigger and greater. It's not a goal. Because at the end of the day, if we're free for the sake of being free, what's the point?
No, I think that this was a misunderstanding, or a way I expressed it which was not right. For me, freedom it's even a principle. And in fact, it's a goal in the way that we have to protect the principle. We have to protect the principle of freedom. And it's part of our concept of human being. It's not by accident that what I can see now, you have even people now coming and very strongly saying, Sharia for al-Hurriya, for Sharia, that freedom comes first. And then we are talking about, I think it's essential. It's, for me, Karamat al-Insan, the very dignity of human being is based on knowledge and freedom. And knowledge because there are freedom.
There needs to be some ethics along with freedom.
Oh yes, I know, but the principle of freedom is there. Now, the way we have to know, and this is why I'm telling you, that if you come with freedom and, for example, ethics, and a philosophy of concept of human being, your responsibility that are so essential, with freedom comes responsibility, and with responsibility come an ethics of freedom. It's the way you deal with this. That's essential, but we have to deal with it. We have to deal with it. And this is what I wanted to say. Okay. 1, 2, 3. So, can you try to... Yeah. Does it work?
thank you very much for this intellectual gymnastic.
Intellectual.
Because
this could have two meanings, but that's I will
no,
take the positive one. I will take the positive one.
No, take the positive one because I mean that you have to work out all the muscles in your brain in order to follow up everything, because theory and each word in what you say has a meaning, and then you have to have all the muscles of your brain. That's why it's more intellectual gymnastic. But as an educationalist, so I have we talk, when we, as educationalists, we talk about theory, we talk about practice, and within between we talk about theory practice. And how do you see that if we want to understand you very well, that we need much more a new education reform as well in our schools, especially in Western societies? How can we reach out with such knowledge? Because then we need more didactics, because the questions you asked in the very beginning about the why and how, they are didactics questions. And we talk about the why, the how, the whom, when, the what, when we teach our students to introduce something, that they have to understand how, why, and who to teach. But how do you see that, how can we reach this theory of practice, to understand the theory within the practice, within the context? Because that is the problem today. We have much of theories, much of good sayings, but we don't have the understanding of the practice, of the theory within the practice, so that we can apply it within, because the theory is a theory, but in different practices it means different things. Because when you are in a place where, let's take a society like Sweden, that you have a theory and you understand it within that context. And this is, I think, our problem is how can we approach education as well?
Yes, just be careful with. I think it's a critical question. Just know that within the way we structure even this week, we started with the methodological question, which is the theoretical framework. By definition, today was theoretical. What you're asking is, okay, that's fine. Thank you for all that. So now we have the answer today. Be practical. Now I'm going to say something about this, because I think it's a multidimensional way of dealing with this. I really think that today we have to work at different levels. We have to work at the upstream level with the framework, and we have to work on that, which is what I was talking about, the concept of human being and the philosophy of knowledge and the philosophy of around it. We have to work on this, which is the framework. Now we also have to deal with the way we deal with our means, and this is going to be a specialized way of what, for example, Dr. Mohamed is doing in his field, in the fiqh and in the authority and the prophet and the Quran, and the way we have to deal with all these means, and what others are doing with the Quran, with the Sunnah, what others are doing with their own field for example, I'm seeing people that are working quite in a way which is quite interesting in medicine, in bioethics, coming with new questions that are helping us inductively to come with the framework. What we have to do with our education is something that, in fact, if you look at our education at different levels, I would say that instead of being obsessed with teaching the rules and the prohibitions, we might have to rethink the way we are educating through the why. So, which is also something which is missing in the West, is missing everywhere. So, education which is an inductive put is, of course, depending on the ages, but having something which has to do with educating about Islam, which is within a framework which, once again, is inductive, is why. It's much more important now to know why you pray that you have to pray in the world today. Why? So the way we are dealing with even our rules, why you fast, don't you think that the great majority of the Muslims should be re-educated on why they fast? why do we fast? Why is the purpose? And I think that we need to think about a new way of dealing with the meaning, and this is why in the center we try to reconnect the principles with the objectives and the ethics, because ethics is helping you to get a better understanding of the objectives. So this is where we have to reassess our education and the way we deal with it. We can't just lead in educating our children and ourselves is not going to work. But understanding the rules without, so understanding how to implement the rule, why you have these rules. So this is why, in my way, through all these years, the only thing that I see is reconnecting even the different knowledges and sciences. So I think that we have to take from different trends. There is no one trend that can give us the solution today on this. So the way we have to be practical on it is it might be to do it exactly the same. Is how do we deal with the objective? We explain the objective in education that is helping to get a better understanding of the means. That would be a way.
I would like to come back to the critical thinking and maybe have a question. Why do we lack today critical thinking in our society, especially within the Muslim, maybe, and Arab world? And why do we prefer to always delegate the thinking to other people, like scholars, for example, whereas we can also have the same thinking or approach about any matters, whether it's religious or material or physical or science, etc. And if I go back to questioning the means in the light of the goals that you mentioned, is it a problem of the educational systems, which you touched on before, or maybe is the lack of freedom, or what do you think from a perspective is the reason for lacking this critical thinking?
I will surprise you. I think it's neither nor. I think it's a psychological problem. We are not confident. We are not confident, and we feel dominated. So at the end, I'm not saying we are not dominated. I'm saying when you feel dominated, when you feel that at the end you have to protect yourself from, you heard about the concept of in English it would be colonizable, colonizability. This is what Malik Nabi was, and in fact he's referring to a notion that we had been colonized because we were colonizable before. That there was something, and I think the psychological dimension here is a problem where you are scared to ask the questions and to deal with the tradition. It's as if you're not confident with the questions because you're not sure about the answers, or you think it's coming from the others. So this double alienation that we have, even one of the main problems that I'm facing now with Muslims is this double alienation, that they think that something is coming from the West because they don't even know themselves that it's coming from themselves. So it is all this discussion about you need sometimes to go to Western philosopher to tell you, you know what we got in the West is coming from there. I say, wow, I didn't even know that. I didn't even, this distinction between the religious and political power, the notion of the state and the notion of religion authority is something that in our tradition is put completely differently from the Western tradition. But I would say that we are scared. There is a psychological factor. And then there is also something which is worrying, is that when you get out of this fear and you ask the question, sometimes you are now jumping into a Western way of putting it, thinking that it's ideologically void, and you feel that, yes, that's it, I'm critical. And I think that this is where the problem is for us, to be able to deal with the critical thinking that should be an open space within our tradition with the center and with the goal. not in a void which is, completely scattered. Because that's very, very, and there are some, I don't know if you read Sabah Mahmoud or Talal Assad. I think you have to read these people, because they are dealing with the internal dynamics that are very interesting. That an ideology that doesn't say its name, that sometimes you take in fact because you are scared from within. So you jump outside and you feel that you are courageous outside. The point is to be courageous within. It's to speak out. So it's a question of psychology, it's now a question of education. It's a question that we are not also dealing with what I was saying, a hierarchy between sciences. A hierarchy between sciences. I'm sorry, I don't know why the faqih should tell me the final word on economics when he hasn't studied economy. And he doesn't know the dynamic. So he might say the first impression, but not the final word. And I'm not saying that I don't need him or her, but I can't rely on him or her only. That's also something which is essential. Yeah. And then 15?
Okay. I have a question regarding the problems that you have mentioned about the fragmentation of science and deconstruction of knowledge. So you have said that you think that it's done on purpose, right? So you think that the deconstructions and fragmentation is done on purpose. So my question is, who you think is driving this kind of deconstruction and fragmentation? So do you?
What did you say? توكلوا على الله. No, I think that no, it's not, a hidden mind. That I would say that when there is no transcendence, when in fact, in philosophical terms, let me tell you a story. I studied philosophy. Before I went to Egypt for my Islamic studies, and I brought all my philosophical education to Egypt, and I went through, the scholars and dealing with, sitting down and in a very traditional way, as we do for getting the ijazat with the scholars and this thing. I was in studying philosophy in Geneva, and I saw it myself. It was in front of me. The way our department in philosophy was taken over by analytical philosophy. The one who was leading this, theology is the only so-called science that has no object, because God doesn't exist. And the whole analytical philosophy is based on three main things that are very important: language, the object, and truth. And then if you see the way it's structured, it's deconstructing everything. It's just the language. There is nothing which has to do with the essence of things. It's just the means, and then you deconstruct the whole notion of, vintage time, for example. We're dealing with this, which is, wow, it's going very... So in fact, what was, and this is why you come back to عَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. So for them, this verse, nonsense. Nothing. Forget about it. This cannot be. As much as there is no God, this verse is nonsense. And then you understand why. Because at the end with this, if language has no real dimension of beyond communicating facts, but has no reference in it, then you come to no truth, and then you come to the object is a construction that is always based on the subject, that at the end you talk to yourself and you construct reality. There is no reality but what you are creating on purpose. So in this way of dealing with philosophy, you can see that the way you will have in different sciences this approach, which is going pushing and pushing and pushing. So what I'm saying is that on purpose is when you push rationality to its limits, that you say that the limits is that rationality is talking against itself, and it means there is no truth and no God and no reality. That's the point. So at the end, your question is why I'm saying it's a philosophy of knowledge. Because you are clearly setting something which is here quite clear, that you say there is one God. It's an assumption. That this is something that you cannot prove from reason to reason. You're not going to prove this. But you are setting this as saying, as much as you cannot prove that there is no God, I cannot prove it rationally, but this is the center on which everything, language and knowledge, is going to be serving a purpose, a goal. And I said this from the beginning. If not, you have a philosophy that is pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing rationality. And at one point you go along, you go along, you go along, and you don't feel that you are falling into the trap, which is rationality against rationality in the name of rationality. And you were there, but you were lost. Because you didn't put at the beginning the access, the center, and then the goal. So this is where, yes is an act of faith. It's an act of faith. It's before and after rationality, but it's there. If not, you are not going to, and it's where you can see that in rationality, if there is no light in it, there is darkness.
Actually, this is the conclusion that Rajai, as you said, and Ibn Taymiyyah reached, right? So based on this, or that Greek
about the Greek
rationality, yeah. It's far. It's putting them far from the truth, right?
Yes and no. It's a bit more complex than this in the Greek rationality of the being, because he was responding to Parmenides' understanding what is and what is not, and saying this logic, which is based on, in fact it's very complex, because it's coming back to the Hegelian understanding that is based on the Greek tradition, which is in fact the very meaning of the is. That in the Semitic language you don't have the ears, and the Greek tradition is all based on the ears. I am something. So Hegel was saying, you are yourself and something else. And in fact, in the Semitic tradition, you don't have the ears. So the ears is creating a logic in the structure, your intellectual structure, that is problematic. It's not as far as this, but the point is that here there is a sense that we have to be very careful about the logic, the intellectual logic of the whole structure. So I know it's very far, but I would come in a very simple way by saying, when you deal with sciences and we see, it's very confusing. I was so impressed by the intellectual power of some of my professors. For example, I studied for 2 years, I was dealing with psychology and at the same time Switzerland. They were very powerful, but there is no center. Say, wow. So it's Shantani. No, because I'm sorry. It's very, very, there is a very great deal of intellectual seduction. Oh yeah, you can be seduced. You know that. By beauty and by intelligence. It's finished. So I told you the last question because I told her, I have still 2 minutes. I'm taking my time. Is it right? No, you are right. So the last question.
Thank you.
It could be a comment without a question if you want.
I'll try and be quick. I did have one comment, one question actually.
Yeah.
So, are you having a different conclusion from the previous speaker? Because that was the whole thing about revelation and rationality. And the previous speaker put logic or rationality first and then faith. And your conclusion is faith before reason, which personally I can relate to. But I'm just interested that already we're seeing maybe a different perspective. And would you say that because human beings are barzakh, the combination of this mysterious, infinite aspect, the soul, and the material, that if we are going to have this clear goal, this axis, that is actually the supernatural part, and that's why it should take precedence ultimately over the rationality, or it guides the rationality. That's my question. But my comment was when the sister here raised the issue of why are we not more critical. Myself, I would say that applies to everybody, not just Muslims. If you look at the world order, you know, it is in the benefit of the few, and we can ask why are the many not more critical? And is it because we feel powerless? Is it because, in a way, it could be false humility? And that's also, my answer to that would be, for example, even me questioning like this, I feel a little bit concerned because we are brought up, especially as Muslims, that being humble means not being arrogant. And so what is the correct etiquette? Like, I want to just keep pushing and asking, and that's my curiosity. That could be the think and reflect command of Allah, but then you get to a point and say, well, no, you should stop the questioning now. And in a way, many of us are taught because the scholars know better, and we can ask, but up to a point. But for me, when we limit that point too soon, I think that is also a reason why we are in the state that we are, because we have been told through people who we are told are knowledgeable that to question is actually not right, or actually will be bad for our souls because we are not being sufficiently humble.
Okay, thank you. So the second was a comment. For the first thing, I think that what Sheikh Chauki put was reason first and revelation after. You didn't put faith. So in order to understand revelation, we need reason. On this, I agree. Even though I would put in reason more than only reason, because from an Islamic perspective, there is reason, and there is also what he was talking about, the fitra and the spark that we have, the light. But reason, of course, we need reason to get revelation. So he was not putting reason before faith, he was putting reason in order to get revelation, if I am not mistaken. So on this side, I agree with my brother. With love and respect.
It's a Lazhari notion, or idea.
Of what?
Yes,
but he wanted al-wahy al-dakhili wal-wahy al-khariji. Yes, that's right, that's pretty fine. But the way he was putting it, I think it's something that we agree upon this. Now, the relationship between faith and reason is something else. It's a bit different, because while we put faith in reason and when we put reason in faith, this is something that I would put at the beginning as well. But I think that on this we might even agree. That's it. You are done for this morning. It was a light program, as you see. So